Okay, good afternoon everybody. You're very welcome to the Geary seminar today. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Boroka, who's an assistant professor in the School of Sociology here in UCD and also a Geary fellow. And previously, prior to coming to Ireland, she was also an assistant professor at the University of Essex. She has her PhD from University of California, Berkeley. And today Boroka is going to present to us on a very timely topic, which is the school schedules of unaccompanied migrant children in the United States. So Boroka will speak for about 40-45 minutes, and then we have time at the end for questions, comments, suggestions, and moving the work forward. So Boroka.
Marvelous. Thank you so much for that amazing introduction. It's always very strange hearing about yourself, you know. Also, I really appreciate all of you being here and the opportunity to share my research. And I especially appreciate it because I study time. So I understand this hour of your life that you're donating to hearing about time is very precious. So I'm very grateful. I'm also grateful to Kamila Kolpashnikova. She's my collaborator on this paper. She's also an assistant professor over at Western University in Canada. Ooh, let me see if I can change. Yes, I can. So my work in general, I focus on the relationship between time and well-being, very broadly construed. And I do both qualitative and quantitative methods. And so this is just a small portion of my work looking at how school schedules matter for what are the school schedules of migrant children. Until now, we didn't know unaccompanied migrant children, but also how are the schools dealing with the influx of unaccompanied migrant children that the US has been experiencing? What's happening to their schedules? So it's quite descriptive, although we theorize a little bit about schools and institutional change in the paper. So by the time my talk is over, I am hoping that you will all see that in the US, unaccompanied migrant children are actually more likely to be based into low-income schools, which is, I guess, not super duper surprising, but that low-income schools are also more likely to have rigid class schedules compared to high-income schools. But as the number of migrant children increases in a given postal code, there's evidence, we are calling it sociotemporal realignment because it sounded kind of fun, but there's evidence for the school schedules actually becoming more flexible. And we'll talk about why we think that is. And so this is actually an interesting contribution to the literature simply because there is literature on rigid school schedules in low-income schools contributing to school-to-prison pipeline, but then what happens when these kids are being put into these rigid schedules in these low-income schools? Do they become more rigid or do they become more flexible? And surprisingly, they actually, there's a bit more flexibility in the school schedules after the number of migrant children in that zip code increases. So to us, this suggests that this is an important area, obviously, for further research, but there's also evidence for time being an important thing to examine when we think about institutional change. So as entrenched institutions change, time temporal parts are very important to consider in how that change may happen. So the context. These quotes are actually, so for context, these are just two little quotes from a larger documentary outside of the scope of my paper. So these are two quotes from a documentary looking at the lives of migrant children, but specifically the journey to the US. And I thought they were fitting just because they all come from different journeys. So the first quote is from somebody named Kevin from Honduras, who came to the US because his mom was really poor. And often in this documentary, they left without parental permission. Their hearts were breaking for their parents. Sometimes they didn't have parents. And they took it upon themselves to come to this land that they saw in the movies that was so much better and came by themselves. The youngest, I mean, they're infants coming. The second quote is from a 10-year-old who was smuggled through his parents, right? A smuggler gave him to a man, who gave him another man, and then took it to a lady, and then they were caught. So he was explaining his journey. And so their circumstances are super precarious, but not unique. And the striking thing about their situation is that until 2002, they were actually held in adult detention centers, so no access to education. And then this is despite the fact that there was a 1982 Plyer versus Doe Supreme Court case that established that children actually need access to education. So just because their immigration status might be in flux, that doesn't mean that they shouldn't have access to just basic education while they're under a particular age, right? So despite this, they were still in adult detention centers. And then in 2002, the Office of Refugee Resettlement took over for their care, and then started settling them into situations. But until 2002, the tricky thing that is going on in the US now is it was assisting between 7,000 to 8,000 children until 2012. From 2002 until 2012, 7 to 8,000 children. But since 2012, we are seeing over 100,000 a year. So right now it's 100,000, well, as of last year, I don't have 2025 yet. So over 100,000 minors are arriving at the border, seeking refuge without a parent. So in total, since 2012, we have received approximately 750,000 children, sorry. So almost 800,000 children at the border without adults. And so then the Office of Refugee Resettlement has to find a way to get them placed with sponsors. Okay, so their journey, in addition to being precarious until the border, it's also quite complicated past the border. So their first encounters with the Department of Homeland Security. So these are the people in the police costumes and the bulletproof vests. And then they're handed over to the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is actually a part of Department of Health and Human Services. And then the Office of Refugee Resettlement is mandated by law that in 30 days, they have to place them into a stable situation. They have to find long-term custody in the least restrictive setting. So this means obviously no jails, no adult jails. So I think that's the purpose of this 30-day rule. So most of them end up foster homes, group homes, or individual sponsors. And I say most because according to the literature, most of them don't end up with family sponsors. So they end up with people that are not parental sponsors. So I think they try to maybe place them with families, but often they end up with non-parental sponsors. And then the striking thing about their situation is that they don't have a mandate. The organizations don't have a mandate for follow-up visits. So we actually don't know what happens to them after they're placed. So there are no follow-up visits to what's happening in the placement itself, what's happening in the schools. So repeatedly every year we keep running into newspaper articles literally saying, oh, we lost 85,000 children. This was in 2022, we lost 85,000 children. Where are they? We don't know. Or newspaper articles saying, well, they're being trafficked. Sometimes they're forced to work in slaughterhouses because nobody wants those jobs, sometimes in factories. So often these cases will emerge where the kids are in forced labor situations after placement. So people come to pick them up that volunteer to pick them up, but they're actually volunteering because it's like a organization that's volunteering to do that for selfish reasons. So their journey is complicated, and because of the data limitations as far as tracking them, we obviously do not know what's happening with them, both within their placement, but also in the school system. But we do know some things from the literature. So from the academic literature on schools and migrant integration, or there's some qualitative literature on their situations in public schools. We do know that public schools in the United States especially are critical for just getting these kids to know what it means to be in the US, right? It's their first encounter with other people that are from the US, maybe children that were born in the US. So very critical for social integration. We also know from the literature that they do need education support services, just considering their journey, considering that often they don't speak English when they arrive. They're coming through lots of countries, sometimes alone, or maybe with like a random adult that they don't really know. So they need services catching up with being at the grade level they're supposed to be in. But they are more likely to be placed into under-resourced schools per the qualitative literature that I've been diving into. And then looking at under-resourced schools, so there's a huge discrepancy, and perhaps it's the same here, or maybe it's the same in Europe also, but very large discrepancy between the experiences of students that are going to under-resourced schools in the US, as far as student-teacher ratios are very different. more rigid class schedules, so there are qualitative papers on how time is used as a mechanism of control. It's essentially like a prison to school pipeline situation where they show up at the door and, you know, there's the security guard and there's the metal detector, and then they are sometimes like frisked, searched. Whereas the wealthier kids, of course, don't have that experience. You know, they're going to, if it's a public school, it's still almost like a Montessori school that's very responsive to their needs and their schedules, lower student-teacher ratios. So completely different experiences. Let's see. Another thing we know about this literature is that in the environments that these kids are placed into, obviously, or environments of children in general matter. So socioeconomically and temporally flexible school and institutional environments, such as, you know, adequate student-teacher ratios down on the bottom, schools that can provide school meals, schools that are resourced enough to have like pencils and erasers, maybe colorful things, are actually crucial for enabling the kids to be able to just focus on work. They're fed, they have tools. And then of course, area level characteristics that allow especially migrant children to maintain links to their native language, so people that can help them get acclimated to this new environment and culture are significant to surmounting obstacles when it comes to how to navigate the place, especially if you don't have parents, you can imagine. So we do know that that racially diverse areas in the US do a better job integrating kids into the school system that come from the descending countries that the population is also living in. So these are not surprising. Now, in our paper, what we really don't know is what's happening to the school schedule. So we do know that poor schools do have more rigid schedules, but we don't really know what's happening, although I gave a spoiler in the beginning, to the schools once these kids arrive. So although there's a large body of research on the topic, we still have a lot of questions. We know that they struggle in school, we know it's hard for them, but there's just not enough clarity on their population level experiences, like what's happening to them as a population of almost 800,000 kids. We know that migrant children are more likely to be placed into resource poor schools. How the schools manage their schedules is unclear. And then due to data limitations until this point, we really weren't able to just systematically look at their situation. So what happens when they're placed into migrant-serving schools? Do the schools that are already under-resourced, do the schools maintain their under-resourced previous rigid schedules? Or do the schedules get a bit more flexible? So we hypothesize, that based on the literature, of course, that they are more likely to be placed into low socioeconomic status, under-resourced. I say Title I schools because in the US there's a program called Title I that gives federal funding to schools that are super duper poor. So based on the literature, we suspect that yes, they're probably, even if they're being placed with non-relatives or maybe foster homes, the chances of them being in poorer areas are higher. We expect that low SES schools would also have more rigid schedules just based on the literature, but we don't know, well, until this research, because I thought that the presence of the children would be a stressor. So you don't have enough teachers, you don't have enough staff, suddenly there's a very needy population coming in, so do you just clamp down on your schedule, or do you try to manage it in a different way where it actually becomes flexible? I personally suspected they would clamp down, but as it turns out, as I've already given away the punchline, they don't. So in order to get this paper to be a paper and for these results to be what they are, we got very lucky in some ways because the New York Times released an unaccompanied child migrant data set. So it covered 2015 to 2023, and it contained over 550,000 child migrants. So it captured when did they come in, the zip codes or the area codes they were placed into, which also corresponded with the area code of the school, and then the sponsor placement dates when they were placed. And so this isn't a nationally representative data set, so we struggle with that in our analysis, and I'm happy to send out the paper. Like for people that want to see all the robustness checks, I'm more than happy to send out an actual paper. You know, you can just email me. But to get at like, okay, we have very basic demographic data about these kids, and we know where they are being placed. That allowed us to actually link with another really fun data set called Unlocking Time, the Unlocking Time bit. And that one was collected by Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It was a large grant that funded a nationally representative sample of school time use. So when are schools starting, when are they finishing, how are they rotating their schedules, student-teacher ratios, child outcomes, demographic characteristics within the schools. So that was really fun to link with. And then we were able to, because of the zip codes, we were also able to link these two with the American Community Survey. So that one is conducted yearly by the National Census Bureau. It's a cross-sectional national representative sample of the US population, their households. That gives us, essentially in this data set, it gave us like zip code level characteristics. So all of our analysis is at the zip code level. So we know how many kids are going into each zip code, and then which schools are in the zip codes. There are some flaws, of course, that we try to correct for, but it's the closest we could get to like trying to see, okay, where are they going, what's happening with them, what are their experiences like? Are they going to rich zip codes? Are they going to poor zip codes? So you've already seen this diagram earlier, but it's helpful because actually it captures the measures we are using. So to capture, we started with regional differences. And to capture regional differences in education policies and funding allocations and demographic characteristics, there are a lot of regional differences in the US. We thought, okay, the main regions of the US are important to incorporate. These are, Midwest was our reference category, Northeast, Southeast, Northwest, and Southwest. To get at the postal code level socioeconomic and sociodemographic characteristics of each postal code, that prior research showed us that it was very important for children's schooling outcomes. We also control for where are these schools located? Are they in a suburban? Are they in a city, super urban area, more rural town situation? And then rural locations were our reference category. So this kind of looks at socioeconomic disparities across the schools, because often rural schools tend to be more under-resourced public schools. Then we also include median household income in a postal code, because this also, first of all, it shapes school funding, but it also tells us like, okay, what are the environments these kids are living in? But mainly it really does shape school funding. And then we look at, knowing that we are looking at a population that comes from South America, we also classify postal codes based on the racial composition. So we look at postal code level racial factors. So like a mostly Hispanic postal code, we coded as where a Hispanic population makes up at least 70% of the postal code. And of course we did that because prior research shows that if they're going into environments where other people are also Hispanic, they're coming from Latin America, then maybe it's a little bit easier for them to integrate. Maybe people are able to advocate for them, right? So 70% Hispanic, with each of the other non-white racial groups, Black or Asian being below 10%. We allow for the dominant white percentage to vary more than 10%. So, and of course we followed somebody's example. So if people want to see the exact reason we did all this, I'm happy to share the paper. So a mostly white postal code is when the white population is more than 70%, with each of the other racial groups being below 10%. So that intuitively makes sense. White presents minimal representation of the other groups, so maybe they wouldn't encounter that much diversity in that postal code. White shared postal codes are where whites constitute between 50 and 90%, with no other racial group exceeding 10%, and then white Hispanic postal codes is where they're a bit more balanced. So these postal codes, Hispanics constitute 10 to 70%, white can be 10 to 90, and Black Asian below 10. So this was actually kind of the hardest part about the papers, grappling with the postal code level racial characteristics and how to measure them. So then school level characteristics, Title I schools are the schools, as I mentioned earlier, in the US that receive federal funding because a lot of their kids come from environments below the poverty line. So they receive federal funding for things like supplies, pencils, sometimes extra help, like extra English second language learner, assistant teachers, sometimes after school programs, and the schools have quite a bit of leeway in how they allocate that extra funding. Of course, extra money for food because their kids are coming from situations where they don't have food. So that gives us like, okay, what's going on with that school level socioeconomic environment that the kids are in? And student-teacher ratio, just because it's so important to grapple with when it comes to learning and children's outcomes. And for school schedule rigidity, this comes from the unlocking time data or flexibility. We created a scale and we tested in different ways. So we also dummy variabled some and their supplementary models if somebody wants to read them. But we stuck with the scale just because the results were actually quite similar and the scale was kind of intuitive. But we created a scale ranging from one being, this is a very flexible schedule in the school, to a very, very rigid schedule. And what do I mean by that? So in the unlocking time data set, there was a question about class rotations. So how often do your classes meet? And then the survey was filled out by principals. So the principals could say at different time each day. That's quite flexible. At the same time each day, except for these particular days, that's in the middle. And then at the same time each day, we're always meeting at the same time each day. And then class, so that was class rotation. And class meeting frequency is how often do your classes meet. So some classes, flexible schedules met on varying days. They were quite fluid in how often they met, sometimes every other day, and then sometimes every day, depending on the school. And often it was very resource, as we saw from our data, it was very resource driven because rotating your schedule takes a lot of coordination. The office is involved, teachers are involved, you need the space for it. And then of course, as I said earlier, we try to do a lot of robustness checks, especially knowing that our kids are not nationally representative. So the number of unaccompanied migrant children received by a specific postal code is just a continuous variable. Yes, look at that. So this just shows sample descriptive characteristics, and I'm sorry that I got slightly lazy. I always have such a hard time making pretty pictures out of tables. It's so much easier to like make the table and you struggle through making the table and then you're like, okay, here's my table. So that's what I did. So the green squares or rectangles just show you the means. It's just sample descriptive characteristics. And you have two blocks of columns, schools without unaccompanied migrant children and schools that have unaccompanied migrant children, that have received unaccompanied migrant children. And looking at zip codes, schools that are located in particular zip codes, area codes. So schools in particular postal codes. So the mean number in schools that have received unaccompanied migrant children is 43. So that's actually like a kind of a nice number if a school receives mean 43. The proportion of Title I schools is slightly higher. I'm just translating for those of you in the back, plus numbers are kind of hard to understand. Like, it's sometimes nicer to hear them out loud. The proportion of Title I schools is slightly higher among schools with unaccompanied migrant children than those without. School schedules rigidity is actually similar in this very descriptive snapshot. Schools with unaccompanied migrant children have a higher student-teacher ratio compared to those without. Schools without unaccompanied migrant children tend to be more rural and town versus more urban, so they're going into more urban areas. Minor variation geographic location, so Midwest has slightly fewer schools compared to those without. Southeast has slightly higher, which makes sense because they're actually closer to the border. Racial composition is interesting because schools without unaccompanied migrant children are in predominantly white postal codes, so that matters, whereas schools with unaccompanied migrant children tend to be in lower proportion of mostly white and higher proportion of mostly Hispanic or mixed white Hispanic postal codes. And then median household income was similar across both groups. So this table just shows t-test of means, like just starting to dig more into descriptive statistics, looking with actual tests, examining differences in school schedule rigidity and the number of unaccompanied migrant children between Title I and non-Title I schools. And we do see that there are associations between school level socioeconomic status, as indicated by Title I eligibility, school schedule rigidity, and the presence of unaccompanied migrant children. So Title I schools, which are the ones that are lower in socioeconomic status because of their kids' sending situation, family income situation, and how they're funded based on that, tend to have more rigid schedules on the whole than non-Title I schools. And this is exactly what the literature was hinting at, although not until now, we haven't been able to very strongly show it with a nationally representative data set. And this, obviously, it's a statistically significant difference, does align with the literature. And so overall, the t-test results do show that Title I schools significantly differ, both in terms of schedule rigidity and the number of unaccompanied migrant children they receive, highlighting that, like, yeah, there's an interesting intersection. So regression results, again, at the very end, for those of you who want to see the regression table, I do provide it, although, again, I'm happy to email the paper. I think that would be the easiest. Here, I just summarized them, and I already gave away my little spoiler alert earlier that there is a significant negative association between the number of unaccompanied migrant children and schedule rigidity. So, in other words, the presence of these kids actually aids the transformation of the school schedules, enabling low-income schools to embrace more flexible schedules, which is very interesting considering that I used to be a manager of a public school a long time ago. One of my coworkers loves making fun of me for all the jobs I've always had. But school schedules are almost impossible to change because they just get so entrenched. Like once you have your bell schedule down, they don't change yearly. They really do get entrenched with each principal. I think it takes a principal change to change a school schedule. So the fact that these under-resourced schools actually have more flexible schedules despite the resource limitations that they're contending with is very interesting to me. And then, yeah, student-teacher ratio, of course, is negatively associated, and that's to be expected. Yeah, so schools with migrant children, as I said earlier, are in postal codes with a lower proportion of predominantly white populations and a higher proportion of Hispanic or mixed. Compared to the Midwest, all other regions show negative associations, and then city and suburban. So locality matters, though sometimes it can be non-significant. Okay. So far, what did we do, or what did I do in this rapid-fire talk while battling with these slides? I try to systematically examine just the population-level educational environments of these children in the US, and really think about how do the schools manage their schedules when they receive unaccompanied migrant children, considering their resource limitations and knowing that they're going into environments that are under-resourced. But more importantly, we were able to show that, yes, at the national level, low-income schools do tend to have more rigid schedules, echoing the literature talking about present-to-school pipelines. Also that unaccompanied migrant children are more likely to be placed into low-income schools, and even though this was intuitive, it's still like, okay, this is happening. But the fact that their presence actually aids the transformation of the school schedules, I think is impactful, even though, so the schools are embracing more flexible schedules, even though there are some intuitive explanations to this. So as somebody who moved into the US without speaking English, I went through the English second language situation. So of course, when you receive a migrant population, maybe not even just one child, and you're mandated to provide some services by law, yeah, you have to provide some services. So in my case, I went to a very under-resourced school, and so they shipped some of us out to a middle school, but it still affected their schedule because then they had to ship us, like, integrate us back into the school schedule. And so they grappled with how to make the schedule so that it serves everybody. And then if the school's super duper under-resourced and they can't even do that, they don't have a bus, let's say, to ship you to the middle school. I have also seen students being placed into special education courses who actually did not require special education courses. It's just that they needed to learn English. So schools grapple with English language learners in different ways, but the fact that they're on the whole grappling through their schedules, changing toward more flexibility, which happens to reflect the schedules of the better resource schools, I think it's a fun finding. So thank you so much for listening to me, and I'm very much looking forward to your thoughts and questions.